Senate Republicans unveiled a police reform bill on Wednesday. It comes after President Trump signed an executive order about new law enforcement standards. Skyler Henry has the details from Capitol Hill.
Senate Republicans, led by South Carolina's Tim Scott, have unveiled their police reform proposals.
I think this package speaks very clearly to the young person who's concerned when he's stopped by the law enforcement officers. We see you.
The bill includes required national reporting of use of force, increased training for officers, and incentives to encourage a ban on chokeholds.
What Senator Scott is offering is a sham.
House Democrats say the Senate GOP measure doesn't go far enough.
I am concerned that his bill definitely mimics parts of ours, but without the teeth.
The House and Senate are both expected to bring the bills to the floor next week ahead of the July 4th recess. For several hours Wednesday, the House Judiciary Committee debated the Democrats' George Floyd Justice in Policing Act.
Republicans will not support the defunding of police, the dismantling of police, the demonizing of police.
It's about police overuse of force, often against African Americans, and America not doing what it should have done rightfully by the people they enslaved and treated as second-class citizens for so many years.
One day after President Trump signed his executive order on policing standards, the White House signaled support for Senator Scott's bill.
There might be amendments to it, there might not, but we want to see this come to fruition.
White House and Senate Republicans say the Democrats' bill is a non-starter, in part because it eliminates qualified immunity, which shields police officers from lawsuits for conduct on the job, unless they violate clearly established constitutional rights.
And to dig into this, Skyler Henry joins me now. We're also joined by CBSN political contributor Molly Hooper, who is a veteran Capitol Hill reporter. So, Skyler, as we heard in your piece, Democrats say that the Republican-sponsored police reform bill just doesn't go far enough. What do they say must be included in any type of lasting reform?
Well, hey, Lana, good evening to you. Well, on the macro level, you'll hear that Democrats essentially say that there are some pieces of Senator Scott's bill that mimic their own. The problem is, at least according to congressmen and women like Karen Bass, they say that it lacks certain teeth, particularly when it comes to the language in the bill itself. Take, for example, things like chokeholds and no-knock warrants, where Democrats are calling for a ban on such measures from police. They say that Senator Scott's bill doesn't do that. When we heard from Senator Scott, who essentially said that while he isn't banning chokeholds, he is pulling federal funding from police departments who do use those measures. And so from his perspective, he's saying that you're basically taking two different routes to reach the same finish line. But House Democrats say that this is simply not enough, and truly that Senator Scott's bill falls short of meeting the core of the need for the police reform in the first place, and that is to address racial injustice and police brutality on communities of color throughout the entire country. Now, Democrats will probably put forth some effort as this moves forward onto the floor in the next week or so. The conversation about bringing up police immunity, things like that, they probably want that on the table as well. But I think stricter language is something that Democrats want, whereas Republicans, at least up until this point, have put together this bill, so to speak, that addresses a lot of the same conversations that Democrats want to cover, but they say that there needs to be a little bit more in order to really address the true problem put forth here, Lana.
So let me ask you about that, Skyler. If the administration feels like chokeholds should not be allowed, that they're willing to withhold federal funding for it, why not just go ahead and say, we ban chokeholds?
Well, I think the conversation ultimately comes down to allowing police to really have control, if you will, of their departments and their jurisdictions and in their cities as well. But what you ultimately see here is that Republicans and Democrats both agree that there is a problem here, that there needs to be police reform that needs to be addressed in some regards. I think it's just a matter of how lawmakers are deciding to go about this issue here. Now, the other interesting thing here, too, you remember that conversation conversation about creating a registry for police officers who are, let's face it, bad police officers. Democrats say that Senator Scott's bill isn't as transparent in terms of the call for a national registry, whereas in the Democrats' bill, that is the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act, they're calling for a transparent essentially a platform where people can access whether these law enforcement officers have excessive use of force, have used their weapons and things like that, so that they don't get hired, say, in another jurisdiction if they are involved in incidents where a deadly use of force case may have occurred.
Right, we're seeing a lot of these current cases that there is references back to other times when they were using inappropriate force or were subject to disciplinary action because of some of the other actions that they've taken. But at a time when words really do matter, Molly, Senator Tim Scott, the only black Republican senator who is crafting the Republican legislation, said that he believes that it's possible to have a, quote, robust debate with Democrats about some of the issues in this bill. So what will it take to see both sides of the aisle actually work together to try to dismantle systemic racism and usher in police reform? Or is that not the goal, according to both sides?
I believe that is the goal of both sides. It's just a matter of how do you attain that end. And as Skyler was saying, both parties, I mean, and Tim Scott said, we agree on about 70% of what's in, respectively, in both of the House and the Senate bills. It's just a matter of the means by which you get to the end. And Republicans believe that if you tie a lot of these, a ban on chokehold to money that these departments get from the federal government, that would be more effective, because in the hearing yesterday that Senate Judiciary Committee had, one of the key police women on one of the panels said, absolutely, if we were at risk of not getting federal funding because we didn't give data to a national database or we didn't ban chokeholds, absolutely that impacts our behavior, because we need those funds. We need those funds to increase community out-orienting police programs that a lot of the members of both parties have been talking about. So again, Democrats are taking a more of a mandated approach. Republicans are trying to go a more incentive-based route, but as it's been said, they're really trying to get to the same end. And I think that it'll be instructive next week when the Senate tries to take up the bill, because, again, it's not clear that the Democrats won't block that attempt to bring up Tim Scott's bill. And if the Republicans are able to get 7 Democrats to agree to move on to consider the bill fully, that's when we will see even some Republicans offering amendments like banning qualified immunity. And then we'll see those senators all vote on the floor.
Let's actually... Sorry, Molly, I just want to put a pin in that for a second, because the president has balked at the idea of removing legal protections for officers accused of excessive use of force. So are other Republicans signaling that they are interested in separating ways with the president over that issue?
Yes, there are. I mean, these members are reacting to their communities. They go home to their communities every weekend, but now many of them are still in their communities because of the pandemic, and they're seeing what's going on the ground. And even today, Kelly Armstrong, Republican from North Dakota, said he doesn't agree with banning the qualified immunity outright. However, if that's in the final bill, then he would go along with it, because there are so many problems, with this idea of not being able to sue a police officer who kills somebody for unwarranted purposes. And again, I've seen 1 or 2 Republicans in the Senate signal that they want to end qualified immunity. And when it comes down to it, if the president does veto a measure that, say, both chambers agree on, they can still override his veto. And this is an issue, as Tim Scott said, it's not going away. There's so much groundswell of support for reforming the police system that, it would be hard for the president to veto something like that.
Yeah, and that's where I want Skyler to weigh in, who since you really follow the Trump administration, I'm wondering if you can give us a better sense of how the president might react to the bill proposed by the Senate Republicans, especially if there were the amendments that removed the provisions for qualified immunity for police officers. Would the president risk actually vetoing the police reform bill that had passed both chambers in order to just to keep that qualified immunity provision in there to protect officers who are accused of crimes?
Well, up until this point, they have said that it is a non-starter in terms of including that police immunity, or removing it, I should say, for this police reform bill. And we've heard that from Kayleigh McEnany, the press secretary. We've heard that from the president himself. And so I think that that is something that is really going to be something that Democrats push really hard for in terms of trying to include that in whatever piece of legislation actually does move forward to the president's desk. But if you listen to what Kayleigh McEnany said earlier today, she says that the White House fully stands behind what the Senate Republicans have put forth today. And so you have to imagine just the conversations that Senator Scott has had with the president. He referenced some of those earlier today during his press conference as he was announcing his proposals. And he said that they were on the right track of doing something that they think would be impactful in a way in terms of addressing police reform in the country. Now, as far as the logistics there, and as far as particularly police immunity and things like that, that remains to be seen. But I do think that the ultimate picture here of creating some sort of legislation where there is a registry, where they do address no-knock warrants, where they do address chokeholds and things like that, I think that will ultimately come forward. As for everything else, that will be kind of what holds this up, if anything, moving forward.
Okay, well, I want to switch gears while I still have you guys for another moment. Skyler, on Tuesday, the Justice Department filed a lawsuit to stop former national security advisor to President Trump, John Bolton, from releasing his book. Remind us what was expected to be in this book, and why is the Trump administration really so concerned and interested in blocking it?
Well, this is one of the first times that we're getting an inside look, if you will, from a Trump administration insider. I mean, if you just happen to click on the Washington Post today, we just received new information that claims that President Trump tried to get China to actually interfere in 2020's election. And that, of course, mimics a similar situation as to what happened in 2016 with the president and Ukraine that he was brought up on those impeachment charges for. And so I think this is going to be one of those first times that we get a real look, particularly from the former national security advisor, on just how he recounts his time while he served under President Trump. He also goes into detail, at least from some of the information that we're seeing, just what others in the administration thought of the president while he was doing things like his foreign affairs and having conversations with leaders of other superpowers, particularly Russia as well, and China. And so this will be one of those first-hand looks that we get to see what happens here. Now, the White House has pushed back on a lot of this. Of course, they said that the National Security Council had to fine-tooth comb, if you will, a lot of what was in Bolton's book, but they say that Bolton actually went ahead with the publication anyway before their removal process was complete. And he said that essentially he's taking an opportunity and advantage of a privilege given to him while having that sort of clearance, if you will, and then saying that he is just trying to take advantage of let's just call it a profiting off of the proximity, if you will, to the president up until this point. And they also made mention of the fact that they think that John Bolton is trying to really slander the president in certain ways. We've heard the Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney and the president dispute some of the claims that were put forth in the book itself, saying that they never told John Bolton a lot of these things. And so it'll be interesting to see what comes forth with this book and how the Trump administration responds to it all together.
Yeah, well, Bolton's not the only one coming out with a book. President Trump's niece, Mary Trump, is also expected to release a book. Skyler, what more can you tell us about this?
Well, it seems like if you have close proximity to the president, now is the time to get a book out because this is coming soon, too. Now, Mary Trump says that she was the New York Times go-to source as far as the president's financial records, as the New York Times put out more information over the president's obviously much talked about claims to not only being a billionaire, but his taxes and things like that. She also goes into the relationship between the president, his brother, and just that dynamic as well. She's the daughter of Fred Trump, and so that will be an interesting dynamic to see here play out as well. Now, as for what comes of that, as for what the White House is saying, that remains to be seen, but of course, certainly a lot of bad PR, I think, for the Trump campaign at least, and so they're trying to get in front of it as much as possible, but she is coming out with a book. This is a Simon & Schuster book that's coming out as well, so it remains to be seen what comes out in terms of fully in this, with all this information, but it should be interesting, Lana.
All right, Skyler Henry, Molly Hooper, thank you both for being with me.
Thank you.
Thanks.